I'll be sitting down here in a minute. I talked about this a little bit earlier. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. I've got it right here. I don't have to be turning around. Okay, now you can tilt me down. What we have observed this last week is exactly this. They want to create a one-world government. They want to protect this earth. And I believe that most of these people absolutely believe this is what needs to be done.
Yep.
And they're going to do anything and everything they can. And they prove that they're going to do anything and everything they can, including censoring the leader of the world. I mean, they've just gone nuts.
Yeah.
And I got to get off this subject. Get on. I promised you guys a long time ago to cover Isaiah chapter 27, and that's what I'm going to do today. So, oops, here, hang on. Let's see. Okay, now, Israel gains their freedom. And today we're going to talk about chapter 27, 25, 26, and 27 were about the end of the Great Tribulation period. And it vacillates back and forth from being toward the end and at the end and just after the end of the Great Tribulation. But we're going to get into that in a little more detail here in a little bit. Some quick review. I'm going to get into a lot more detail in the 10 birth pangs, but just for a reminder. 1, the return of people of Israel. We have seen that clearly. 2, one world government forming. Definitely, that's in the works. Apostasy, I haven't covered that yet, but that's in the works. Nations aligning for prophetic fulfillment. End time technology. False prophets. Nations in distress. Famine, pestilence, earthquakes. Violence upon the whole earth. Signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars. Coming, not this week, I'm going to talk about the apostate church next time. But for right now, we're going to review chapter 26. And it's been, what, a month since we talked about this last, because of Christmas and New Year's and the messages and things. So, just in chapter 26, and I'm not going to get hardly into the verses, but in verses 1 through 4, and before I do that, chapter 26, the entirety of it was a song, and it was a song written by God to the Jewish people to sing at the end of the Great Tribulation. So, in verses 1 through 4, he's telling Jerusalem and us to trust in the Lord always. Trust in Him always. And in 5 and 6, in 5 he's speaking of and to the people concerning Babylon. And in 6, the poor and the oppressed trample the ground. In other words, at the end of the Great Tribulation, the poor and the oppressed are going to trample on those who have been overruling them for those 7 years. Now, moving on to verse 10, the Lord is kind to everyone, but the wicked take no notice. And that is, God has provided for everybody, including all those, and unfortunately many, and today most, people that just turn their back on him and thumb their nose at him. They deny him, they do everything. And this last week, they just went tromp, tromp, tromp. Well, that's going to get turned around. Verse 11, a theme of Isaiah's, your upraised fist. You know, in the Old Testament, I want to do this now, God dealt more with the physical than the spiritual. I'll get into this in just a little bit more, but God would discipline Israel by his neighbors. Verse 11 ends with, let your fire consume your enemies. That's what the Jewish people are saying to God to deal with the people at the end. And in the end of the Great Tribulation, there's going to be great fire. We believe it might be an atomic war, but we don't know. Verse 12, God enables us to accomplish things. God has created every single person for a purpose. Unfortunately, most people turn their back on and they use the gifts that God gave them to do evil. And we see that going on all the time. In verses 13 and 14, those who were served before are dead and gone. Now this is referring to the end of the Great Tribulation. Imagine, excuse me, imagine having lived in that period of time and gone through what the beast will have done. He will have sucked them into an agreement. They will think great peace is coming, and then the last 3 years and 3.5 years are going to be just atrocious. Of course, that is what's going to bring the Jewish people around and back to God when they realize what has occurred. Now, verse 15, O Lord, you have made our nation great. Now, I showed you this when I did chapter 26, but you can see the outline that at least one person had for what Israel will look like. Of course, this is not, I don't think this is exactly correct. It's going to go from the Euphrates River, which is more toward the right-hand side of the screen, and the Wadi el Arish in Egypt, which is the lower left of that map, will be the actual borders. And we'll find out. In a few years we'll see it all come together, but God's going to bring that together for the Jewish people. Now, continue on in verses 16 and 17 of Isaiah chapter 26. The birth pangs come upon them after the rapture. Now, we see the birth pangs growing and approaching, but when the rapture occurs, that's when everything's going to start happening. In verse 18, the Jewish people recognize that they have failed God, but only after dealing with the beast. God has to let the beast come in, take over, do his thing, just absolutely trash everybody before they'll go, oh, this guy's not right, we're not right. And then they will correct themselves. But unfortunately, God has done that. And unfortunately, we have been living in the period of grace. with the church. And we have enjoyed God's grace now for 2,000 years. But the end is coming, and it's coming soon. And God will no longer deal gracefully with wicked people. People who have rejected Him, who just continue to sin, who honor abortion. I mean, I just heard this morning that in New York City, they have agreed to post-birth abortion. In other words, after a baby is born, they murder it.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're fighting.
Life starts at conception. And here's a newborn baby, which everybody loves, quote, anybody with any kind of sense at all, and they just murder it. Where was I? Verse 19, but those who die in the Lord will live, their bodies will rise again. Now, that verse goes on. I don't want to get into it right now, but that's the clearest presentation by God in the Old Testament of our resurrection. I have been studying the teachings that come out of Institute of Creation Research. They're using science to prove Genesis 1 through 12, the flood, everything, and it makes so much sense. The Bible is absolutely true. Everything it says is true. We might misinterpret it and we might get things wrong, but it's true.
Amen.
And there are so many people out there trying to say, oh, well, it can't be true because of evolution. Well, evolution never existed. Verses 20 through 21. Hide yourselves while I clean up, then you can sing this song. God is right. He's right at the end of the Great Tribulation. He tells His people in Israel, hide yourselves. Get under a rock or do something, but get out of the way because I'm going to deal with that. And the great trump will sound at this time. And the Jews who get out of Jerusalem will be spared. But those who don't, it's not going to be pretty what happens at the end of the tribulation. So, let's now finally discuss chapter 27. In that day, and I'm going to stop right there. In that day. That's said 3 times in chapter 27. And that day refers to the Great Tribulation and at the end of the Great Tribulation. In that day in that day the Lord will take His terrible, swift sword and punish Leviathan, the swiftly moving serpent, the coiling, wreathing serpent. He will kill the dragon of the sea. Now the serpent is believed to be Satan, and he will punish him.
Yeah.
But he will kill the dragon of the sea, and a lot of people have interpreted that to mean all the evil that's in the world right now. He will kill it. It will be dead. The people who live through the millennium will not have to deal with what Satan does. And okay, verse 2. In that day, sing about the fruitful vineyard. Now this is another song, and it's a shorter one. I, the Lord, will watch over it, watering it carefully. day and night. I will watch so no one can harm it. Now here God is saying he's going to watch over Israel and Jerusalem and the Israel people. We were watching that actually happen right now. Israel, I mean, Israel's neighbors would just love to squash that little tiny country. And it's a tiny country. I mean, it's not as far as from here on the coast to Newport, 50 miles wide. And it's not as long as this state is wide, or tall, I should say. It's only a couple hundred miles, so 50 by 200 miles. It's this little tiny thing. And God is protecting it, and he will continue to until the very end of the tribulation period. And then everything's going to get renewed. Okay. Verse 4. My anger will be gone. If I find briars and thorns growing, I will attack them. I will burn them up. Unless they turn to me for help, let them make peace with me. Yes, let them make peace with me. Now here God is addressing the Jewish people in Israel, the ones who don't believe in him. And he turns around and he begs them to come back to him. God has just, throughout his Bible, he keeps calling his people back. He gives them warnings. He tells them, he brings prophets like Isaiah to say what's going to happen. Come back to me. Over and over again he says, come back to me. And to us today, we need to come back to God.
Yeah.
So many people have just turned their back on him. We need to turn back to God, praise him, and trust in him, especially right now with what's going on.
Yeah.
Okay, 6. The time is coming when Jacob's descendants will take root. Israel will bud and blossom and fill the whole earth with fruit. Now, that's happening now, both literally and figuratively. Israel, or the Jewish people, are creating fruit and exporting it in great quantities. And that's only 1 or 2% of their whole national income. But they're literally providing fruit to the world. But figuratively, they need to be giving their love of God. And that's the fruit that I think is the most important here. Now 7. Now, verse 7 I had a problem with. Listen to this. Like the striking of him who strikes them, he has struck them. Or like the slaughter of his slain, have you been slain? Now can anybody tell me what that says without reading the rest? I read that, and I read it, and I read it, and I read it, and it just did not make sense. But this is one of the reasons I tell you, read more than one translation. Have your favorite translation, read it, and when you run into something you don't understand, go to other translations and read them. Here's the New Living Translation. Has the Lord struck Israel as he struck her enemies? That makes sense to me. Has he punished her as he punished them? We know that the countries surrounding Israel would end up literally being destroyed by God and would no longer exist. Now he has, because of Israel's turning their back on him, he has punished them for that, but he's never destroyed them. He's never destroyed their people. So, and again in verse 7 in the New International Version, has the Lord struck her? Has he struck down those who struck her? Has he been killed as those who killed her? Just another, and that helps you to understand. So we've discussed 7 and then 8. No, but he exiled Israel to call her to account. She was exiled from her land as though blown away by a storm from the east. Some people believe that was Babylon, and actually that did occur. Babylon came, all the people, took them into captivity and kept them there for 70 years. And Israel has never been an independent state since. That was actually, back then, that would have been called Judah, and we now call that same area Israel, but it has not. And until 1948, when they returned, they've never been an independent state. And now they are. Let's see, 9. The Lord did this to purge Israel's wickedness, to take away her sin. As a result, all the pagan altars will be crushed to dust. No Asherah pole or pagan shrine will be left standing. Now the other translations turn this crushed to dust. They talk about various kinds of stone, like sandstone and things like that the altars are made out of. They're usually a soft rock that is easily formed, and they made their pagan shrines out of them. And what he's saying is that they're going to be crushed to dust. And a Asherah pole, those are wooden symbols to the goddess Asherah. They're going to be gone. And that's what Israel has to do, is to get rid of these altars that they have brought into Israel. 10. The fortified towns will be silent and empty, the houses abandoned, the streets overgrown with weeds. Calves will graze there, chewing on twigs and branches. We know that there are no longer any walled cities. I mean, it would do us little good to put a wall up around our city, because all somebody would have to do is get a grenade launcher, drop it in there, poop, and they would get us anyway. Not to mention air-flown missiles and bombs and everything else that people have now. So we know that today walled cities don't work, and those old walled cities, they're gone, and they're just being the animals and stuff, they've just moved in. If we look at, for instance, Detroit, which our country closed down just a couple decades ago, the automotive industry, because we sold out to China and other countries. And have you seen, how many people have seen the pictures of those companies? They're all filled with weeds, and trees are growing, and they're falling apart in just a very short period of time. That's what's going to happen. Verse 11. The people are like the dead branches of a tree, broken off and used for kindling beneath the cooking pots. Israel is a foolish and stupid nation, for the people have turned away from God. Therefore, the one who made them will show them no pity or mercy. Now this, again, is what will happen at the end of the Great Tribulation. Those who are there, who have not turned to Him, who do not believe in Him, there will be no mercy, and they will be killed, and unfortunately they're going to end up in hell. But those who believe and who have escaped physically, in this particular case, will live on, and they'll turn to God. And we'll see here in verse 12 what happens. Yet the time will come when the Lord will gather them together like hand-picked grain. One by one He will gather them from the Euphrates River in the east to the brook of Egypt in the west. In that day the great trumpet will sound. Now we know about the trumpet that will sound at the end of the millennium. That will be a literal trumpet. And no, excuse me. I got to remember what I taught. A trumpet will sound, and He will send out His angels to gather together these people. I honestly, I don't remember. Do any of you remember what I taught on that? The great trump when we are raptured out of here,
Right.
is one, and this trumpet is another one. One is just the voice of God, and the other is a literal trumpet. I can't remember which is which. No, I'm sorry, folks. But anyway, that's God gathering His saints. And then He will bring back again the people that are in exile back to the Jewish land. Now, to give you an idea of the land that we're talking about, the Euphrates River is pointed out by those two red arrows, and you can see that it winds up from the south there, and then heads up north and winds up around and through Turkey. But it'll start from there, and then it'll go to the lower left-hand corner by Egypt down there. And there is the Wadi El Arish, which is just, it's a little river, a little tiny river. And you can see it flowing there, and that will be the southern boundary of Israel. But during the millennium period, that's where the Israel people will live, and we will be other places, except for Ernie, who will be hanging in his hammock between
Right.
the
Well, I just looked
tree
up,
of life.
I just looked up that in Matthew chapter 30, verse 30 and 31, it says, and then, of course, talking about the end of the tribulation, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with great power and glory. In verse 31, and He will send forth His angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together His elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Man, is that going to be cool! But we'll be up there with
We'll be up there watching.
We'll be returning with the Lord. That's the second advent right there.
But is that His voice or the trumpet sound?
Well, it's going to be great.
Well, in order to know, you have to read the Greek.
Right.
Because they're two different words. So, but anyway, I had that figured out one time in my poor empty brain, you know. But anyway, okay, that was chapter 27. Now, Ernie and I discussed this. We're going to be going on next week, starting with chapter 28, and then we're going to burn through to chapter 39. And in chapter 40, we will get back into the prophecies. But in chapters 28 through 39,
That sounds pretty good.
yes, and here I'll show the rest of the chapters here in a moment. This is Ernie, your book from your professor, and I can't think of his name right now.
Oh, the Invisible War?
Yeah.
Barnhouse.
Yeah, Barnhouse. These are literally from his notes. Chapter 28 through 33 is the perilous woes upon Israel and Judah. 34 through 35 are the predictions of the Great Tribulation and Millennial Kingdom. 36 and 37 looking back to the Assyrian invasion. Now notice it's looking back. Everything that's in here we have studied in less detail than what is given here in these chapters. So in 38 and 39, looking ahead to the Babylonian captivity. So we have covered all this stuff in detail, but what's going to happen is Isaiah just went deeper and deeper and deeper. Now, how many people want to get their PhD in this? Piled higher and deeper. I feel that right now there are more important things for us to learn. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through these chapters, and each of us will be able to decide at that time what we feel is important and pertinent to us today and or for what our learning. In fact, in chapter 40, there's a phenomenal discussion about Jesus Christ in chapter 40. And that's how it's just going to continue from 40 through 66. But during that period of time, I will be teaching the 10 indicators that Christ is coming back. So I will teach some of that, and then I'll teach about the chapter, and I'll pick out specific things. I'll probably, as Don does, he reads the whole chapter. I will probably do that. But previously I have commented on every verse in every chapter as we've gone through this. So for 28 through 39, I will only be picking up the high points. If you want to know more, let me know. But for now, that's how we're planning on doing it. And when we get to 40, and the thing is I think we're going to get raptured out of here. We're hoping, after what just happened, please Lord take us. But then I stop and I think about my friends and I go, wait a minute.
I believe he's going to give us more time.
Yeah, well, good.
No doubt.
Good. Anyway, chapters 40 through 66 is where the rubber hits the road. I tell you, that's
good stuff.
Isaiah has been called the fifth gospel, and understandably. This is why the Jewish people today are told not to read Isaiah. Because if they read Isaiah, they go, well, isn't that Jesus Christ? It's so obvious.
Yeah, it's so obvious.
It's just like this thing that happened to our president. He said, people, go home now. Do not do violence. And then the other side turned around and said, he incited them to violence.
Yep.
The whole world is just going crazy.
Yep.
That's it for today. Thank you.